In today's video, I'm going to demonstrate Japanese water marbling, or Suminagashi. I'm going to look at traditional techniques using traditional materials and more modern techniques and ways to do it easily and quickly at home. Suminagashi involves floating ink on water and then transferring that pattern that is formed on the surface of the water to paper. The water doesn't have to be thickened in any way like Western marbling. Most people will find an ink lying around their house that'll work. Dishwashing soap can be used as a surfactant, and a lot of different papers, as long as they're not too heavily sized, will work. For many years in America, the expert on Suminagashi was Don Guyot. I'm sorry if that's not how you pronounce his name. He wrote this wonderful little book, which remains the best source of information on the subject, in the West anyway. He also produced a Sumifactant that was sold through Colophon books that is really handy to use. Unfortunately, Don passed away this year in September 2020. Another excellent source that I highly recommend is Anne Chambers' book, which has very practical information on how to do Suminagashi, has wonderful, beautiful, inspiring photos, and has some portraits of modern Japanese Suminagashi artists. So let's get started. You'll need some brushes. I'm just using quite cheap Asian calligraphy brushes, and I've got a brush stand. I like to keep my brushes in these brush rolls. It helps keep the shape of the tip of the brushes, though you can just roll the brushes up in some paper as well. I'm going to start by using a commercially available marbling kit from Japan. It's available in art stores all around the world. It's not that expensive, and it's just easy. You don't have to muck around with adding surfactants to ink. Though you can try lots of inks. Just get a plastic container, put a drop of ink on the surface and see if it floats and doesn't dissolve. The traditional way is to grind up ink sticks on an ink stick stone, and I'll demonstrate that in the second half of the video. That's the more traditional approach. I've already pointed out these brush stands. They're quite cheap. You can pick them up at art stores, and it just keeps your brushes organized and in the right order. In Don's book and in his workshops, he used to use these little lotus bowls, but I've found them hard to get. This is a Sumifactant that was manufactured to Don's specifications. You can get that from Talas or Colophon books. I've also used ox gall, the same as often used in Western marbling, but I've also found that dishwashing soap, just a couple of drops in about 1/4 cup, works very well also, and I'll use that to start out with. Many types of paper work. You just need a paper that's not heavily sized and will absorb the ink. If it is a bit sized, then it may not absorb this ink really well, and you can just wash off the excess, and that's fine. And you need a tray to put the water in, and the paper needs to fit inside the tray. Cat litter boxes work really well, though I'm using a laboratory tray. So let's get started by filling the tray with water. Well, I'm not going to fill it. I just need about 1 inch of water in the tray. People say that water quality is very important, but I've never had a problem with anything other than tap water. So I'm going to start using this kit. So I'm going to put some black in a little beaker, and then I'll put the colors in a palette later. But I'll start with the black. I'll use the kitchen chopping board to put the wet paper on and take it over to the sink to rinse off the excess ink. So I'm just going to start with black and clear. And clear is the surfactant, which was a few drops or 2 drops of dishwashing soap in about 1/4 cup of water. So I'll charge up the brushes and then alternate touching the surface of the water with the tips of the brush. You really don't want the brushes to go too far below the surface of the water. If you do, the ink will sometimes sink to the bottom, and that's usually not a problem as long as it stays on the bottom of the tray. The traditional approach is to produce lots of concentric circles and then manipulate the pattern with air or wind, or just let the pattern evolve. Just any disturbance in the room, in the air, or any residual disturbance in the water moving about will cause the pattern to change and evolve into something interesting. According to the books, the earliest existing piece of Suminagashi is from the 12th century, and it was used for writing poetry. So that was the typical use of Suminagashi decorated paper, is for calligraphy. So the pattern tends to be subtle. It's not super bright and overbearing like most Western marbling. Traditionally it was a subtle pattern to decorate the paper that was then used for calligraphy. Until relatively recent times, Suminagashi was associated with its use by ruling classes, and its manufacture was kept a secret by the families that were allowed to do it for these ruling classes. And it's only in recent times that it became generally used, and in modern day Japan, as well as being done on paper, it's commonly done on silk, especially kimono silk. To pull the print, just lay the paper down from corner to corner like is traditional with Western marbling, and then I rinse off any excess ink, though if you've got fairly absorbent paper, that step may not be necessary. Once a pattern has been built up on the surface of the water, it can be further manipulated through the movement of air or through combing, usually with something like a skewer, or a human hair is also traditionally used, which can produce some really interesting results. I think it's important to realize that there's a lot less control over the pattern than, say, in traditional Western marbling. I like the thing that Don Guyot used to say. He'd say, it's not about how do you do Suminagashi, it's how do you arrange things so that Suminagashi occurs. Traditionally, Suminagashi used black, red and blue, and the pattern wasn't very strong and the colours weren't very bright. However, today we're not restricted to traditional techniques, and with this kit especially we can use quite bright colours, and we don't have to be restricted to concentric circles as well. We can put dots down all over the place and be as creative as we want. On YouTube there's a number of videos of people being extremely creative and colourful for decorating silk. The patterns are quite wonderful, and I highly recommend you have a look at these videos for inspiration. In terms of manipulating the pattern with air, the most traditional approach is to use a fan. However, a straw can be used very effectively as well. It gives you a little bit of control about what part of the pattern is manipulated. I always pull the print by putting the paper down from diagonal to diagonal, though on the internet I had seen a number of people in Japan put the paper down the way I just demonstrated, where you sort of put it down from the center out to the outer edges. You can reuse the water in the vat quite a few times. The new colors will push the mixed up colors to the outside. However, eventually the surface of the water will become quite contaminated. In Anne Chambers' book, she talks about using this contaminated surface in a creative way, producing what she called funky art. You can remove some of the contamination from the surface by dragging newsprint across the surface of the water, but after maybe a half a dozen prints, it's a good idea to change the water also. I think my favourite pattern is the jagged or disrupted pattern, and this is produced by vigorous fanning close up. I've heard the patterns being described as representing things such as the flowing motion of wind-blown white cloth and patterns seen in slowly running streams. The colours in the kits and prepared inks tend to be very bright. My favourite colours, the reds and the blues, I've only been able to achieve those by grinding my own ink, which is fairly straightforward, though you do need one of these slate ink stones and some high quality ink sticks. It takes me about 10 minutes to grind up about 1 milliliter of each colour ink. I've tried cheap ink sticks off eBay with unsatisfactory results. These old ink sticks are on loan to me, and I've also bought some vintage ink sticks from Japan which have worked really well. There's no secrets to making this ink, it just takes time. Just grind away until the ink the colour is solid enough. As I've already mentioned, it takes me about 10 minutes to produce 1 milliliter of ink, and then I add 2 drops of the Sumifactant to that, and then I leave it overnight. The Sumifactant is the Sumifactant that Don Guyot designed and sold through Colophon books, though I did buy mine from Talas, the same with the book. I'm going to use the Sumifactant at 100% strength, so it's quite strong, and it's going to be stronger than the inks, and the result is that the lines are going to be quite narrow, but it also means the colour in the lines will be stronger. Then I'm going to experiment by adding a couple more drops to each of the colours, and that means the colours will push out against the clear stronger so that the lines will be wider, but the colours won't be as strong either, which is more the traditional look where the pattern is quite subtle. You can experiment with the surfactant made with soap as well by adding a couple of drops to strengthen that, or you can add some of the surfactant to the ink that's been put in the palette to strengthen the surfactant in those if you want to spread out those colours. It's all about creating a balance between the clear and the colours. Now, the last ink I made for the day was the blue, and I was making the ink just before dinner time, and I was in a bit of a rush, and I ended up not grinding the blue long enough, and the colour is very weak. So weak that I stopped using it after a couple of tries. I could have gone back and re-ground the blue, but I was in a bit of a rush to get the video out. Most of the paper I've been using has been quite heavy. Now I'm going to try using a very lightweight paper. The trouble with the lightweight paper is once it's wet, it's prone to tearing. To pick up thin paper, it's a good idea to use a dowel, which provides a lot more surface contact with the paper. You're not likely to rip the corners off the paper. The paper I used earlier was an 80 GSM photocopy paper, but it was a paper that had a bit of tooth to it. And I also used Mohawk Superfine. Mohawk is a really good paper to use, but it's a bit heavy. The thin paper I'm using here is just a generic 50 GSM bank layout, and it works pretty well. I do have a bit of excess colour that needs to be washed off, so it's not completely absorbent. The best paper I've used was 100% Kozo Washi. Ozo Washi in Tokyo sent me some samples to try out, and some of them were beautiful to use but horrendously expensive. This is an example of using a hair to comb a pattern. I think this is my second favourite way of manipulating the pattern after using the fan. I get a bubble under the paper here, which is a sure sign that I was rushing. Now I'm going to add a couple of drops of Sumifactant to the inks, and I think you'll notice straight away that the lines, the coloured lines, are significantly wider, but the colour intensity is lower because the ink is more spread out. You can adjust the width of the lines and the intensity of the colour by depositing more ink, by holding the brush to the surface longer, which you do also once the amount of ink starts to run low in the brush, and also the brush starts to absorb water out of the tray, which also dilutes the ink. This is the last pattern for today. I've really enjoyed doing this video. I really enjoy doing Suminagashi, and I really encourage you to give it a go. You don't need much of equipment, and you've probably got everything you need. As usual, I hope you've enjoyed this video, and if you have, I really appreciate you hitting the big thumbs up button. If you can and would like to support me on Patreon, there's a link in the description below. If you want to be notified of my future videos, please hit the subscribe button and ring the bell. I'll finish with a gallery of some of the prints that I made while making this video. I hope everyone's staying safe, and until next time, cheerio.